People think the worst thing you can find behind a wall is a leak, but they're wrong. Sometimes, what's hidden changes your life forever. My name is Ethan Carter, and for 12 years I had been a plumber in a quiet Pennsylvania town where every street looked familiar and every neighbor believed they knew one another's secrets. My work was simple, honest, and predictable. A clogged drain before breakfast, a broken water heater after lunch, a burst pipe during the first freeze of winter. I liked it that way because pipes never lied. Water always followed the truth, even when people refused to. That Monday began like hundreds before it. My coffee was still too hot to drink when my dispatcher called with an emergency service request at a large Victorian house on the edge of Maple Ridge. According to the notes, the homeowner had reported strange water pressure that came and went without explanation. The address caught my attention because the place had been empty for years before someone quietly bought it 6 months earlier. Nobody seemed to know much about the new owner except that he kept to himself and paid every bill on time. When I pulled into the long gravel driveway, the house stood beneath towering oak trees, its white paint freshly restored, yet somehow untouched by warmth. The front door opened before I even reached the porch. Standing there was a tall man with silver-gray eyes, neatly combed dark hair, and the composed expression of someone accustomed to solving problems without asking for help. "You must be the plumber," he said with a calm voice that carried more exhaustion than confidence. "I'm Nathan Brooks." I introduced myself and followed him inside. The home was spotless, almost too perfect, with polished hardwood floors and family photographs that seemed strangely new, as though they had been framed only yesterday. Nathan explained that every evening, exactly at 7 o'clock, the pipes rattled beneath the kitchen floor before falling silent again. 3 different contractors had inspected the system, yet none had found anything unusual. As he spoke, I noticed he kept glancing toward the hallway leading to the basement, as if something there demanded constant attention. I assured him I would begin with the main supply line. Crawling beneath the old flooring, I expected rust, cracked fittings, or outdated valves. Instead, I found recently installed copper piping connected with remarkable precision. Whoever had renovated the system knew exactly what they were doing. Yet one section produced a faint vibration unlike anything I had heard before, a steady rhythm that resembled distant tapping rather than flowing water. I shut off the main valve, but the sound continued. That was impossible. Water could not move through disconnected pipes. Curious, I traced the vibration toward a sealed section of foundation hidden behind custom cabinetry. There were no blueprints showing an access point, no maintenance panel, no explanation for why someone would conceal plumbing behind reinforced concrete. Before I could examine it further, the tapping stopped completely. Nathan appeared beside me almost silently. His face remained polite, but his eyes searched mine with unmistakable concern. "Did you find the leak?" he asked. I looked back at the silent wall, realizing I no longer believed I had come to fix a plumbing problem. Whatever was hidden behind those pipes had been waiting far longer than a service appointment, and somehow, without understanding why, I already knew I wouldn't be walking away until I uncovered the truth. Nathan did not repeat the question. He simply stood there with the quiet patience of a man who had learned that silence often revealed more than words. I climbed out from beneath the floor, brushed the dust from my work shirt, and looked back toward the section of wall that should have been completely still. "There is no leak," I finally said. "At least not the kind you called me here to find." He folded his arms and gave a slow nod that suggested he had expected that answer. "You heard it too." It was not a question. I admitted that I had. The steady tapping had continued even after the water supply was shut off, something that should never happen inside a residential plumbing system. Nathan glanced toward the kitchen windows where late afternoon sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor. "It always starts a little before 7, he said quietly. "Every single evening." I asked how long it had been happening. "Since the day I moved in." There was something genuine in his voice, not fear exactly, but the frustration of someone searching for a logical explanation that refused to appear. I retrieved my inspection camera and electronic listening device from the service van. Most customers laughed when they saw the equipment, assuming plumbing was only about wrenches and pipe cutters, but hidden problems required patience and better tools. Back inside, I mapped the water lines one section at a time. Every reading matched the renovation plans except for the concealed foundation wall. The signal there bounced strangely, almost as though there was an empty space beyond the concrete that should not exist according to the original construction records. "Did the previous owner leave you any blueprints?" I asked. Nathan disappeared into his office and returned with a leather folder containing property documents, renovation permits, and faded architectural drawings dating back more than 70 years. We spread everything across the dining table. The older blueprint showed a narrow service corridor running directly behind the kitchen foundation, but the updated renovation plans erased it completely. "That hallway should still exist," I murmured. Nathan frowned as he compared the pages. "The inspector never mentioned it. Neither did the contractors," I thought. Someone had intentionally removed every modern reference to that space. At exactly 6:58, the house became unnaturally quiet. Even the old furnace stopped humming. Then the tapping returned. 3 slow knocks. A pause. 3 more. The sound echoed through the copper pipes with remarkable clarity. I placed the listening device against the concealed wall. The pattern was too regular to be random vibration. It resembled someone tapping from the opposite side using perfect timing. Nathan stared at me without speaking. I could tell he was waiting for me to explain what we were both hearing, but I had nothing that fit logic. Carefully, I measured the wall from corner to corner. The kitchen. Dimensions did not match the outside of the house. By nearly 3 feet. That missing space had to exist somewhere. Hidden rooms were rare, but not impossible in homes built before modern building codes. As I packed away my tools, I realized this service call had changed completely. I was no longer tracing faulty plumbing. I was tracing the history of a house that seemed determined to keep one part of itself invisible, and every strange measurement suggested that whoever sealed away the forgotten corridor had wanted it to remain undiscovered for generations. The discovery refused to leave my mind. After loading my equipment into the van, I sat behind the steering wheel for nearly 10 minutes, staring back at the quiet house. Every instinct I had developed during years of solving hidden plumbing problems told me that missing spaces always had explanations. Forgotten renovations, abandoned utility tunnels, sealed crawl spaces. There was always a reason. Yet nothing about Nathan Brooks's home fit any explanation I knew. Instead of driving away, I opened my laptop and accessed the county property database. Older construction permits had been scanned into digital records years ago. Most files were ordinary, but one permit from 1958 caught my attention. It authorized structural repairs after extensive water damage in the basement. Attached to the permit was a handwritten inspection note that read, "Eastern Service Corridor permanently sealed at owner's request." No further explanation appeared. The next morning, I returned to the property carrying a laser measuring tool, explaining to Nathan that I wanted one final inspection before closing the service ticket. He agreed immediately, almost as though he had been hoping I would come back. Together, we measured every exterior wall, then repeated the process inside. The numbers confirmed what I already suspected. There was a narrow hidden section stretching almost the entire length of the kitchen, completely inaccessible from anywhere inside the house. Nathan looked at the measurements in disbelief. "So there really is another room." "Maybe not a room," I answered, "but definitely empty space." We searched the basement for another hour. Fresh drywall covered most of the foundation, but one corner revealed older brickwork beneath chipped paint. A faint draft brushed across my hand. Cold air should not have been moving through solid masonry. I leaned closer and noticed tiny gaps between several bricks that looked newer than the surrounding wall. Someone had repaired this section with remarkable care, blending old and new materials almost perfectly. Nathan retrieved a flashlight while I examined the mortar joints. The repairs were decades old, yet they remained stronger than the original construction. Whoever sealed this passage wanted it to last. Before we could investigate further, the familiar tapping echoed through the pipes again, even though it was barely noon. We froze. For the first time, the sound did not come from the kitchen. It traveled upward through the walls, moving slowly across the house as though following the plumbing itself. The electronic listening device confirmed the strange path. The vibration passed from the basement supply line to the second-floor bathroom before fading completely. Water could not create a moving rhythm like that. Neither could expanding copper pipes. Nathan quietly admitted something he had never mentioned before. Some mornings he found small puddles of perfectly clean water on the hardwood floor, but there were never stains, leaks, or damaged ceilings to explain them. They disappeared within minutes. leaving the wood completely dry. He thought stress had made him imagine them until I nodded and said, "That detail changes everything." Hidden corridors, impossible measurements, unexplained water, and a tapping pattern that ignored the laws governing plumbing were no longer isolated mysteries. They were connected pieces of something much older than either of us had realized. As I looked toward the sealed brick wall, I understood that fixing pipes would never solve what was happening inside this house, because the real secret had never been flowing through the plumbing. The pipes were only carrying its message. Neither of us mentioned calling another contractor. By then, we both understood this had stopped being an ordinary home inspection. Nathan brewed a fresh pot of coffee while I spread every document we had collected across the dining room table. Property records, renovation permits, faded blueprints, and handwritten inspection notes formed an incomplete timeline that seemed to avoid one specific period. Between 1958 and 1961, nearly every official record connected to the house had disappeared. Tax documents existed. Ownership transfers existed. Yet renovation details from those years were almost completely absent. That kind of gap was unusual, especially for a property this old. I asked Nathan whether the real estate agent had disclosed anything about the previous families. He shook his head. The seller had inherited the estate through a distant trust, never lived there, and wanted a quick sale. There had been no dramatic stories, no rumors, no warnings. Just paperwork. Curious, I suggested we visit the Maple Ridge Historical Society before they closed for the afternoon. The small brick building stood beside the old public library, staffed by volunteers who remembered nearly every family that had lived in town. An elderly archivist named Margaret welcomed us with a warm smile and listened carefully as Nathan gave the address. Her expression changed almost immediately. She disappeared into a storage room and returned carrying a thick binder filled with newspaper clippings and neighborhood photographs. Most articles described charity events, holiday celebrations, and garden tours hosted at the Victorian home decades earlier. Then one faded photograph caught my attention. It showed a smiling family standing on the front porch during the summer of 1957. Behind them, barely visible through an open side door, was the same narrow hallway that no longer existed. Margaret noticed where I was looking. She quietly explained that the Eastern Service Corridor had once connected the kitchen to a small utility room used by household staff. According to local stories, the hallway was permanently sealed after severe flooding damaged part of the foundation. Officially, that was the end of the matter. Unofficially, neighbors had claimed they continued hearing unusual sounds inside the walls for years after the repairs. Most dismissed the stories as imagination fueled by an aging house settling through changing seasons. Margaret smiled politely as she said it, but I sensed she did not entirely believe her own explanation. Before leaving, she handed Nathan a photocopy of an old floor plan that had never been included in county records. Unlike every blueprint we had already examined, this version showed a small maintenance hatch hidden behind a pantry cabinet beside the kitchen fireplace. Back at the house, we compared the drawing with the existing layout. Modern cabinets completely covered that section of wall, making it impossible to notice without knowing exactly where to look. Carefully, we emptied the shelves and removed a narrow decorative panel. Behind it, concealed beneath several coats of matching paint, rested a small square metal door no larger than a toolbox lid. Dust covered its surface so evenly that it had blended into the wall for decades. Nathan and I exchanged a silent glance. Whatever had been hidden behind that forgotten hatch had remained untouched through generations of owners, renovations, and inspections. For the first time since receiving the service call, the mystery was no longer buried behind guesses and measurements. It was waiting quietly on the other side of a locked metal door that neither of us had expected to find. The small metal hatch had no visible handle, only a narrow key slot surrounded by tarnished brass that had darkened with age. I brushed away decades of dust and realized the lock itself was unlike anything I had seen on modern utility panels. It looked handcrafted, designed long before standardized hardware became common. Nathan searched through a box of old keys that had come with the house, most labeled with faded paper tags whose ink had nearly disappeared. One by one, we tested them without success until a slender brass key with no label slid smoothly into the lock. It resisted at first, then turned with a slow metallic click that echoed through the silent kitchen. Neither of us spoke. The air seemed unusually still as I carefully pulled the hatch open. A cool draft drifted out, carrying the unmistakable scent of aged wood, dry stone, and something surprisingly clean, as though the hidden space had somehow remained untouched by mold despite being sealed for decades. I aimed my flashlight into the darkness. Instead of a narrow pipe chase, the beam revealed a compact brick passage just wide enough for one person to walk through sideways. Copper water lines ran neatly along one wall before disappearing deeper into the concealed corridor. Every joint and valve looked remarkably well maintained despite their age. Someone had cared for this system long after the hallway was supposedly sealed. Nathan quietly whispered that he had never imagined anything like this existed inside his home. We stepped inside carefully, watching every footing across the old stone floor. The passage extended nearly 20 feet before ending at a reinforced wooden door fitted with another antique lock. Along the walls hung small metal brackets where oil lanterns had once been mounted. The place felt less like a forgotten construction feature and more like a section of the house intentionally preserved outside of time. Then my flashlight reflected off something unexpected. Mounted beside the door was a polished brass pressure gauge connected to the plumbing network. The needle rested perfectly in the center, showing normal pressure even though I had personally shut off the main water supply earlier that afternoon. I checked the nearest valve twice to make certain I had not made a mistake. Everything remained closed. Yet the gauge refused to move. Nathan watched my expression. That should not be possible, should it? I slowly shook my head. Before I could answer, the familiar tapping returned. This time it sounded much closer, no longer traveling through distant pipes, but coming directly from beyond the wooden door. 3 steady knocks. A pause. 3 more. They were gentle, almost patient, carrying none of the urgency that had first startled us. Instinctively, I examined the door for structural movement, loose plumbing, or hidden mechanical devices that might explain the sound. I found nothing. Instead, I noticed a small brass plaque fastened near the frame. Years of dust had concealed most of the engraving, but after wiping it clean, several words became readable. Service access. Keep water flowing. Beneath that sentence appeared a handwritten date from 1958 followed by a signature that had faded beyond recognition. Nathan looked at me with quiet disbelief. Every clue we uncovered answered one question while creating 2 more. The hidden passage, the functioning plumbing, the impossible pressure reading, and the calm, rhythmic tapping all pointed toward a carefully guarded purpose rather than a forgotten accident. Standing inside that concealed corridor, I realized someone had never intended this place to disappear forever. They had simply expected the right person to eventually find it. The words engraved on the brass plaque stayed with me as I studied every inch of the hidden corridor. Keep water flowing. It sounded less like an instruction for maintaining plumbing and more like a promise someone had intended to survive long after they were gone. I knelt beside the pressure gauge once more and connected one of my portable testing instruments. The readings made no sense. The sealed line behind the wooden door was carrying steady pressure even though the home's main supply remained completely disconnected. There had to be another source, yet every municipal record showed only one water connection serving the property. Nathan watched the digital display with growing curiosity. Could there be an old private well? He asked. It was a reasonable question, but I had already checked the original survey maps. No well had ever been registered on the land. I carefully followed the copper line running along the corridor until it disappeared beneath the stone floor through a narrow opening barely wide enough for a pipe. The workmanship was extraordinary. Every fitting had been polished by hand, and every support bracket had been positioned with remarkable precision. Whoever built this system had treated plumbing like craftsmanship rather than construction. Then something unexpected caught my eye. Tucked behind one of the pipe supports rested a small leather notebook wrapped in waxed cloth. Time had faded its cover, but the pages inside remained surprisingly well preserved. The handwriting belonged to someone meticulous, documenting maintenance dates, pressure readings, and repair notes spanning nearly 15 years. None of the entries mentioned mysterious sounds or hidden passages. Instead, the author repeatedly referred to the plumbing network as the house's heartbeat. One sentence appeared several times throughout the notebook. As long as the water moves, the house remembers. Nathan quietly repeated the line after me, trying to understand its meaning. I admitted that I could not explain it. Yet the author clearly believed the plumbing served a purpose beyond carrying water. Near the final pages, the entries became shorter and more urgent. Supplies had become difficult to obtain. Replacement valves were no longer available. The writer hoped someone with practical knowledge would eventually continue maintaining the system. The final signed entry was dated October 1973. After that, every remaining page was blank. We stood in silence for several moments before the familiar tapping returned. 3 slow knocks echoed from behind the wooden door. This time they were immediately followed by the faint sound of flowing water, gentle and continuous, despite every supply valve remaining closed. I pressed my ear against the old wood. Instead of hollow emptiness, I heard what sounded like water traveling through a much larger pipe somewhere beyond the wall. Nathan asked whether opening the second door would damage the structure. I examined the frame carefully. Unlike the hidden hatch, this entrance had been built to open repeatedly. Its hinges remained clean, and the threshold showed almost no signs of settling. Someone had expected regular access. The only obstacle was the antique lock. As I compared the notebook to the collection of old keys Nathan had found, I noticed a rough pencil sketch tucked into the back cover. It showed the exact shape of another key, larger than any we had already tested. At the bottom of the page, a single handwritten note waited as though it had been left specifically for whoever discovered the corridor next. The keeper always leaves the final key where every plumber will eventually think to look. The message in the notebook lingered in my thoughts as Nathan and I returned to the kitchen. The keeper always leaves the final key where every plumber will eventually think to look. It sounded almost like a riddle written by someone who trusted experience more than instructions. I looked around the room with fresh eyes, ignoring the furniture and focusing only on the plumbing. Every professional develops habits after years in the trade. Whenever I entered an unfamiliar house, the first place I always inspected was the main shutoff valve because every repair began there. If the unknown keeper had also been a plumber, perhaps he had hidden the key where another plumber would naturally go without being told. We walked into the basement and stood before the main water service entering through the foundation wall. The old brass shutoff valve was original to the house, mounted on a thick wooden board that had clearly survived several renovations. As I ran my hand behind the board, my fingers touched something that did not belong. A small metal box had been fastened to the back using 2 old screws hidden from normal view. Nathan handed me a screwdriver, and within moments the box came free. Inside rested a single iron key wrapped in faded blue cloth together with a folded letter. The paper had yellowed with age, but the writing remained remarkably clear. It began simply, "If you have found this, then you are not here by accident." Nathan and I read every word carefully. The letter explained that the hidden corridor had never been built to conceal treasure or protect family secrets. It existed to preserve an underground spring that had supplied the original settlement long before public water systems reached Maple Ridge. During years of severe drought, the spring quietly provided clean water to nearby homes through a network known only to a handful of trusted caretakers. To prevent the source from being damaged by careless development, each generation passed responsibility to someone skilled enough to understand the plumbing without drawing unnecessary attention. As modern infrastructure expanded, the spring became unnecessary for daily life, but the caretakers continued maintaining it because abandoning the system could permanently destroy the natural flow beneath the hillside. Suddenly, the strange notebook entries made sense. As long as the water moves, the house remembers. The phrase was never about superstition. It honored the people who had quietly protected a resource that once kept an entire community alive. Nathan looked at the iron key resting in his palm with a mixture of relief and responsibility. "My family never told me any of this," he said softly. The final paragraph of the letter offered one last instruction. The caretaker should never force the spring open for curiosity alone. The door existed only for inspection, maintenance, and preservation. Respect for the place mattered more than ownership. We returned through the hidden corridor until we stood before the old wooden door once again. The steady tapping echoed gently from the other side, followed by the calm sound of flowing water. This time it no longer felt mysterious or threatening. It sounded welcoming, almost patient, as though the hidden spring had been waiting all these years for someone willing to understand its purpose instead of fearing it. Nathan slowly raised the iron key toward the antique lock, And for the first time since I accepted what should have been an ordinary plumbing job, I felt certain that whatever waited beyond the door would finally explain every impossible detail we had uncovered together. The iron key slid into the antique lock with almost no resistance, as though it had been waiting for that exact moment. Nathan looked at me one final time before turning it slowly. A gentle click echoed through the hidden corridor, followed by the quiet release of the old wooden latch. Instead of forcing the door open, we allowed it to swing inward on its own. The air beyond was cool, fresh, and carried the unmistakable scent of clean spring water. My flashlight swept across a natural stone chamber far larger than either of us had imagined. Crystal clear water flowed peacefully through a narrow channel carved into the rock, before disappearing beneath the foundation and into the network of carefully crafted pipes. There was nothing frightening waiting inside. No forgotten vault, no hidden fortune, no dramatic secret. Only a place that had quietly fulfilled its purpose for generations. Along one wall stood a sturdy wooden workbench covered with neatly arranged tools that had long since become antiques. Copper fittings, handmade pipe wrenches, leather sealing washers, and handwritten maintenance journals rested exactly where their owners had left them. Everything had been preserved with remarkable care. A small skylight no wider than a dinner plate allowed a soft beam of daylight to reach the chamber from somewhere above the hillside, providing just enough natural light to nourish patches of bright green moss growing between the stones. The steady tapping we had heard for days suddenly became easy to explain. A small brass regulator attached to the spring line gently expanded and contracted as water pressure naturally shifted throughout the day, creating 3 soft taps every few minutes against a polished stop plate designed decades earlier. It was not a warning. It was simply the quiet rhythm of a mechanical device doing exactly what it had always been built to do. I smiled despite myself. Sometimes the most extraordinary mysteries ended with beautifully ordinary engineering. Nathan slowly walked around the chamber, running his hand across the old stone wall with obvious respect. "This place kept people alive," he whispered. I nodded. Every pipe, every valve, every careful repair represented someone who had understood that good plumbing was never just about buildings. It was about protecting families, neighborhoods, and futures, only to the next keeper. Inside was a simple certificate transferring stewardship of the spring to the legal owner of the property, along with a request to continue preserving the chamber exactly as previous generations had done. He folded the document carefully before placing it back inside the envelope. "I think I finally understand why this house found me," he said. As we prepared to leave, I closed the maintenance log with quiet satisfaction. The service call that had begun with mysterious tapping and impossible plumbing had become something entirely different. We had not uncovered a hidden danger. We had rediscovered a forgotten act of kindness that had quietly flowed beneath Maple Ridge for generations, waiting patiently for someone willing to listen closely enough to hear the true story carried by the water. 6 months later, I found myself driving back to the Victorian house with nothing more dramatic than a scheduled maintenance visit. The gravel driveway looked familiar now, and for the first time it felt welcoming instead of mysterious. Nathan greeted me with an easy smile that had replaced the guarded expression he wore the day we first met. Some houses changed because of expensive renovations. This one had changed because its story had finally been understood. Together we walked through the hidden corridor, carrying a small toolbox and a replacement gasket for one of the century-old valves. Nathan handed me a freshly framed photograph. It showed the hidden chamber exactly as we had found it on the day the old wooden door first opened. Below the picture, he had placed a small engraved plaque that read, "The house remembers because someone always cared." I could not help smiling. It perfectly captured everything we had learned together. We spent the afternoon replacing worn seals, polishing old brass fittings, and recording new pressure readings in the maintenance journal. Following the tradition established more than a century earlier, Nathan carefully added the current date and signed his name beneath the latest inspection entry. Then he paused and handed me the pen. "You should sign too," he said. "Without you, none of this would have been found." I hesitated for only a moment before writing my own name beneath his. Not because I considered myself a caretaker, but because every plumber hopes to leave something better than he found it. Sometimes that means repairing a leaking faucet. Sometimes it means preserving a story that almost disappeared beneath layers of concrete and forgotten paperwork. As evenings settled across Maple Ridge, I packed my tools and prepared to leave. Spring beneath the old house in Maple Ridge, and I remind myself that the strongest foundations are not always built from stone or steel. Sometimes they are built by people who choose to keep life flowing long after their own names have been forgotten.